everyone, and thank you for attending this event sponsored by the New England chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, New England chapter. My name is Dana Gerber, and we're here tonight with Donna Priest, a two-time Pulitzer Prize winning journalist at the Washington Post, where she has worked on national security issues for more than 3 decades. Her work includes reporting on global counterterrorism and intelligence operations, foreign and domestic manipulation of the public through social media, deplorable care of returning service members, and the proliferation of electronic spyware to track and censor civil society, including journalists. Donna, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So I want to start with a question about sort of your education. You attended Morrill College at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where you served as editor of the school's student newspaper, City on a Hill Press. But at the time, you've said you weren't sure you wanted to get into journalism. What eventually convinced you?
Well, it's going to be no surprise, but what convinced me is actually doing it. I was debating between academics, diplomacy, and journalism. And then I had a couple internships, one at the LA Times, but then the one that really got me was at the Washington Post on the foreign desk, which is what I was so interested in. And I, at that time, said, that's it. This is what I want to do. And I went, I didn't get hired because I didn't have much experience, but I went to the St. Petersburg Times, where I was the county government reporter and also sort of a fireman where they could send anywhere, on the spot. So I actually did get to cover some really grisly but fun fires in Florida. And also I got to learn how crazy Florida is as a state. Always fun stories about pets and about people and about land scandals. So I'd had a mentor at the college paper who taught me the joys of researching property records in City Hall. And at that time, the records were on microfiche, which made me sick to my stomach when I sat there too many hours and flipped through them. But I also just learned so much about what you can find out about people, what they own, where they live, all that sort of fun stuff. And I got hooked. So
yeah, I know the feeling.
yeah.
So I did want to speak a little bit about your internships before you started your Pulitzer Prize winning streak and Scared Presidents, which more on that later. One of your Pepper meeting season knocked down a phone pole and knocked out the lights for more than 10,000 people. I'm just curious, how did these sort of wackier stories and early internship experiences shape you earlier in your career?
I was kind of a snob when I came back from Europe. I did a year abroad in Europe, and I was convinced that I was an internationalist and I only wanted to do foreign reporting. And so I made a couple of mistakes when I was an intern on, let's say, the big one was, at the LA Times right away. I didn't go on the scene to a story that was a fun story about how the IRS had created these envelopes to put tax returns in to make it easier for cities to process them faster, but they didn't fit into the postal machines in the big postal facility in LA. And I had this idea like, oh, come on, how interesting is that? And I didn't see it as the story it was. So I just interviewed the postmaster on the phone, and I will to this day, although it's 40 some years ago, I will never forget the editor looking at my copy. He was standing like 5 feet away from me and just shaking his head, because I'm sure I started it with a cliche. I didn't have the scene. And that really made me scared to death that I was going to fail. So, from then on, I always went to where I was supposed to be. And many times I went places that I didn't necessarily have to go, but it was the fun of it. That's really the fun of it, is you get to poke yourself into different situations that ordinarily you wouldn't have a reason to be there. So I made a couple of bad mistakes in the beginning, and then And so when I got to other internships that were also on the Metro staff, because people just don't hire kids, students as foreign correspondents, I really had a different feel and a different way of thinking about what I was doing. I was learning and I was discovering the world. I mean, I didn't know anything about half the things I was covering. So I just all of a sudden had a very different attitude about it, which was, I need to know what I don't know. I need to be in as many challenging situations as possible, because that's where you learn. And if I wanted to go overseas, I had to show people that I could do a lot of different things and that they could trust my judgment. And that meant I had to be in different situations where I made the right judgment. And so, so I always looked for on the ground, weird stories, those bird stories. That bird story was probably, I don't remember exactly how it came about, but it could have been a phone call that I made. So I was always looking for those fun, kooky stories, but also anywhere that was unusual to go to. I remember it when I was a Metro reporter in Washington, when I came back to the Post. There were a number of arson. There was a trend in arson fires in rural Virginia, and I decided to go find an arsonist. So I went to a small town and I talked to the sheriff's department. And this was a town near where there were a lot of fires that were being set. And they gave me the address of a guy who had been convicted of arson. So I just went to his house trailer. And I remember, knocking on the door and just stepping back a ways, because you don't know exactly what was going to come out. But he spent a lot of time with me talking about why he did what he did. And I was just thrilled by the experience, because I don't know, I also covered a lot of prisons and prison overcrowding, and I went into prisons. And again, I found these experiences, just really made me happy and fulfilled, and just wanting to do more and more.
Yeah, absolutely. So once you did end up at the Post, what was it like when you started? Was it, a tough place to break into?
I started in a funny way because I had been an intern on the foreign desk. So my job as an intern was to edit the copy of foreign correspondence, which was kind of a big deal. But then I had a great mentor at the time who was the head of the department, Jim Hoagland, and he let me do a couple stories based out of Washington. So when I came back, that's how I came into the Post. The agreement was for a year, I'd be a deputy foreign editor, the best title I've ever had. And then I would move over to Metro to be a reporter. And so for the first year, that's what I did. I edited stories mainly from the Middle East, some from Central America, where the Contra War was going on. And then I made my way then I was put on the smallest county in probably the country, but definitely in our area, which is Arlington County. And it's a very good government county. So I remember driving over the bridge every day, because I lived in Washington, thinking, what am I going to write about? But lo and behold, I did find some great scandals. And I started kind of an informal beat, which was prison overcrowding, but I started it with jail overcrowding, because that was the time of crack cocaine. And even places like the Arlington jail were getting filled up with people they were arresting who were addicts, basically. And they occupied, 99% of the beds. So I spent how many days? 3 days in the jail, the women's jail. And again, the scandals were really fun. And then once in a while, I would get a crack at a national scandal, because, for instance, the defense contractors live in that area, and there was a good defense contract scandal that I was given. And then I also still had this reputation as a fireman. So when the US invaded Panama, they sent me as one of the team of 5 reporters to go cover the US invasion of Panama and the short but intense war there in Panama City. And that was, of course, thrilling.
Yeah, no, oh my gosh. What year did you start at the Post?
I started in 86.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
like the height of the war on crime, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so what drew you into covering national security?
Well, I wanted to cover, I was forming my ideas of what I wanted to cover, but I was always interested in foreign affairs. And I didn't, at that time, all of a sudden, let's see what happened. I think I got married and my husband didn't want to move overseas, and the Pentagon job came up. So I figured, okay, that's national, that'll get me overseas, but not living overseas, and sounds really interesting. It was the end of the Cold War, so the military didn't really have a clear mission, which was a good time for me, so I didn't have to go to war. I had a blast. I mean, really, I loved covering the military. I found it to be a much more transparent and welcoming environment than I ever would have thought. If you knew where to go and you knew how to talk to people, which I didn't in the beginning, but I learned pretty quickly, they could be fairly open. I was allowed to go on a lot of deployments, peacekeeping deployments to Kosovo and Bosnia, and later when I did a book, I went to Nigeria and Indonesia and some other places with the military. Well, I went all over the world with various ranks, with 4-star generals, then with special forces before they were famous after 9/11. So I really traveled a lot with the military. I was embedded before that name was, popular, well known. And again, I found them to be very open and so important. What the military assets were always so much bigger than what the State Department had, which seemed a little backwards to me. So I ended up doing my first book called The Mission: Waging War and Keeping Peace with the Military. That was a book about how 4-star generals were being asked to be diplomats, and they had many more assets and resources that they could use to do to do diplomacy than the actual diplomats did. And that was pretty much a crisis of the diplomatic corps at that time, because they didn't tell their story. They wouldn't tell their story. They wouldn't take reporters along. People had a harder time understanding the value of diplomacy. So I ended up doing a whole book that really, the lesson of the book is you better think a lot before you send the military to do non-military tasks, because they're really not trained for that. And you get a lot of unintended consequences. So,
What's funny is I think we saw that a lot domestically during the same period, right? Wasn't like Ruby Ridge in that sort of time period.
Yeah, it was.
Things went awry.
Well, they were looking for a mission. And so they were pushing into areas that were different for them. And because it was the end of the Cold War, and not the bipolar world was not existing really. You have these 4-stars that are like Energizer bunnies. They have to do something. They have to they have their own plane and their own staff. So they were, just wanting to do things. So they would be visiting places that the highest ranking person that many people in Africa saw, for example, was a general. That's not the best message for countries in Africa who are under a military dictatorship, for instance. And but that's what but that's what we were doing. That's what the US was doing, is sending the military to do these sorts of missions.
Just out of curiosity, what was it like? I know this is sort of the cliche question, but what was it like? Journalism at that point was still very much a boys' club, and I'm sure the national security was even more so. What was it like to sort of break into that?
It's funny. I think I had more issues in the newsroom than I did out in the field, because in the field, I think people saw me first as a Washington Post reporter, and there was a lot at stake to harass a Washington Post reporter. Being a woman, that's one thing. But if you're a woman who's a Washington Post reporter, you have this, I think, this kind of shield. It was pre-social media, so I didn't get any of that horrible blowback that female reporters get all the time now when they write something that the blogosphere doesn't really like and takes after them. But the other thing that I think I had going for me, and I watched this happen over and over with men who were on the Pentagon beat, is there was a certain kind of chest beating ritual that went on between the males in uniform and the males not in uniform. And the ones not in uniform, the reporters, kind of did this, I don't know, it was like proving that they were equally men, even though they weren't in uniform. And there was some jousting that went on verbally, and just stuff that I didn't have to worry about, because whatever, I didn't have anything to prove in that way, that a lot of my colleagues I found did. And if you fit in, and this is sort of a lesson I try to teach my students at the University of Maryland now, is if you want to be a successful reporter in a place that you don't belong or aren't a part of, in a culture that you're not a part of, be that the military or the CIA or the State Department or the arts or whatever, you have to be respectful of the culture and try to fit into the culture. So what I mean by that as a reporter is, when I was covering the Pentagon, I had my own uniform. I dressed in navy blue and gray, like all the uniforms. I didn't try to stand out. I tried to just, be in the background and listen. And I think that's true with other institutions that we cover, like police. I think the police are also or firefighters or first responders of all kind. You can easily report from inside if you're sensitive to their culture and respectful of their culture, because one of the big lessons I learned about the military was some of my stereotypes were wrong, and everything in the world is much more complicated than a young student might believe, and there are rarely any black and white situations and answers. Lots of gray, though.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that's lesson number one.
Yeah.
So the Washington Post's legendary executive editor, Bren Bradley, said he loved reporters who could find, quote, holy shit stories. And certainly those were the ones that you got. One, you broke in 2008, you exposed the mistreatment of wounded veterans at Walter Reed Hospital. Can you tell us a little bit about how that story came about?
Yeah, it was a story that a person who I knew had asked me to call a friend of hers who had something to tell me about Walter Reed, and they knew by that time I wasn't reporting on the military. I'd already been reporting on the CIA, and I wasn't doing that anymore. And frankly, I did it because she asked, but I didn't quite know what this would turn into. And I called the person, and they said, well, I have heard these very strange things at Walter Reed about the mistreatment of soldiers up there. And I just couldn't really fathom that would be true, because of the way the country was rallying behind the troops, even though, the country was divided over the wars by that time in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I agreed to meet someone at lunch and hear more about it. And at that lunch, I met an older woman who had spent a lot of time up on Walter Reed, who didn't exactly know the context of everything she was seeing, but she had a really good memory and she could describe in detail the types of complaints that she heard from soldiers and their wives. Most of the soldiers were men. And the conditions that they were living in, which were really a holy shit type of condition. And I just couldn't believe it. But she sounded very rational. She didn't seem to be exaggerating, you know, how you're always sizing someone up on how they talk and whether they're saying things that seem to be something they would have access to. So she was also telling me, you know, what she didn't know. But at the end of that, she gave me one phone number. She didn't really have a lot of other contacts that she felt comfortable giving me. And I called that one person. And the next morning I was in her kitchen eating her homemade cornmeal muffins. And she had just a slightly broader view of the situation, but not really the whole thing. So she told me a little bit more and gave me a couple other names. And pretty soon I had the name of a person inside Walter Reed who was able to explain in confidence what in the world was going on, and they could explain the system to me. And that person wanted me to come to Walter Reed, not letting the public affairs office know. And luckily at that time you could get into Walter Reed with just your license. So I didn't have to tell anybody. I could just say I was going to the hospital to visit somebody. And because of the Health Privacy Act, they couldn't ask me who. So I just went in and went into an office and spent, I think, 4 or 5 hours that first visit and just got the fire hose treatment, describing all of this chaos and confusion and wasn't poor medical care, it was poor outpatient aftercare. And there were hundreds of soldiers living in the barracks there, which by that time had been turned into a hotel-like setting. They were completely overcrowded, understaffed. They were losing track of soldiers who themselves could not keep their mind focused because they, you know, were on so many drugs, often psychotropic drugs, because of their PTSD or insomnia. And it was just a mess. And we started, so I got another colleague, Ann Hall, to join me on it. And we started having meetings with individual soldiers off campus in the restaurants, usually in Silver Spring, Maryland, not far away. And they would tell us their story and then they started giving us records. And we found that so many of these soldiers were keeping really good records because it had terrible experiences with the military losing the documents that they needed to prove that they had been injured in battle and then deserved compensation for that. So we had people who had huge Xerox machines in their bedrooms just so that they could copy everything that they were given. So we got lucky about the documents.
Yeah, luck is sometimes just
all
you need at the end of a story. So a few months ago, the folks at the SPJ spoke with another legendary editor at the Washington Post, Len Downey, who said that you, alongside Bob Woodward, are some of the best reporters he's ever known. So high praise, to say.
Yes.
He also told us about having to visit the White House and listen to George W. Bush try to convince him not to publish one of your stories. What a common experience that everyone has, being threatened by the president of the United States. Can you tell us about what story that was and how all that unfolded?
Yes, that was the story that revealed the system of secret prisons throughout Eastern Europe that were set up by the CIA after 9/11 expressly to avoid the rule of law in the United States. These were prisons that very few people in the countries, and I can name the countries now. We didn't name them in the beginning, but now they've been outed by the Senate Intelligence Committee and other reporters. The ones that I was discovering were Poland, Lithuania, and Romania, and we already knew about Thailand, and one that was set up on Guantanamo just for a short period of time. But these were just secret facilities that were a result of a secret negotiation between the CIA and the intelligence head or the president of that country that broke the laws of that country, because those countries were also trying to function under rule of law after coming out from under the Soviet domination. And the whole point was to, when they captured what they called high value targets, people that they thought were leaders of Al-Qaeda, they would transport them into these facilities, and they would torture them over long periods of time. I'm now using the word torture. I didn't use the word torture when I was reporting on it, because we learned about the treatment in very incremental steps, and we felt like we should just name what was going on rather than make the judgment call that it was torture. But then at some point when it became, when many years later, I should say like 5 years later, when the Senate took it up as an investigation, then it became a consensus, I think, among lawmakers studying it and other experts, that some of their tactics like waterboarding and sleep deprivation, and especially in combination, did equate to torture. So, but that's what they were doing. They were interrogating them using a list of what they called enhanced interrogation techniques that was also secret from the public. And they were doing that in an effort to gain information that they said might stop another attack. So you had an agency that had never done this before, that was in a White House, because the White House approved this, that was faced with trying to figure out new ways to find people. Never had any kind of attack like 9/11. We had attacks by countries before, and it's so much easier to target a defense against a country or to be offensive against a country. But this was a small organization, and they didn't even know that much about the organization at the time. So I would say that they were scared to death about what they didn't know. And that's partly why they created this system that was illegal and was expressly out of the hands, took these people out of the hands of our legal system. The FBI opposed it. They had some involvement in the very beginning, and then they were told to not have any involvement because this was contrary to US law. But it took us a long time, probably 2 years, to actually report that story, because highly classified, not that many people knew about it. And by the time I had a finished story, and by the time the president weighed in, I had already been to the spokesman of the CIA, the operations chief of the CIA, then the head of the CIA, who met with my editors as well. And then we told them at every step, we considered what they said, but told them we were really looking for what was it that we were about to report. And they knew what we were about to report, because I told them what was it that they thought would really damage national security. And they kept saying, well, everything, our allies won't trust us, the terrorists will retaliate, and we won't be able to work with people anymore. So Len's, he probably told you this, but his main goal going over there was to press them again. What is it that you really don't want us to report? And so I have to say I was a little disappointed, because they did not ask me to go. And I've told Len before that had I been a male, I might have been asked. That's my personal view. He says it's not true. He disagrees, but that's how I feel. And so he, what he said when he came back was, again, they weren't very helpful, except at the very end, when the one diplomat in the room, John Negroponte, who was the first director of national intelligence, put his arm around Len and said, "You're not going to name the countries, are you?" And Len said, "Is that what you care about?" And he just repeated it. He didn't say yes. And so Len took that as the answer to his question, and came back and, thought about it. We all talked about it again. There were pros and cons in the group that talked, the editors and myself, about whether we should name, whether we shouldn't name. Some people thought we would be complicit in an illegal action if we didn't name these countries, and like, how would we feel in that, being in that country and we keeping that secret. So I propose that we do Eastern Europe, because these countries were new democracies that were trying to stand on the rule of law and minimize the secret secret intelligence agencies that dominated them during the Soviet era. And Len agreed to that. So we did do Eastern European countries. And when it came out, it made a huge splash in Europe. And here, the Republicans controlled both the House and the Senate. Bush was still pretty popular. So really, there was a lot of criticism of the Post, but not a lot of criticism of the black sites, as they were called, except in Europe, where so many reporters went to work to try to find out where they were and try to see whether their country had been involved in granting the US flyover permission or anything else. And so in Europe, it was a big deal, and European reporters made a lot of progress in our understanding of this, the way the system worked. And eventually, those reporters and other American reporters years later were able to name the actual countries. So, because by that time, they were closed down pretty quickly after the stories ran, and then George Bush announced that they were closed down several months after the stories, I believe. Yeah.
At the time, did you agree with the decision to hold back the names?
No. But I was really glad I didn't have to make the decision.
Yeah.
Yeah. There weren't any people quoted in the story because of the nature of the story. Nobody would allow me to quote them who had information. So how am I going to prove to readers that these stories were valid? And the only way really is to get the details out. But, this was these, but I had other details in the story. And I do think that obviously it didn't dampen the story's power by saying Eastern Europe rather than the countries themselves. And I can absolutely understand why Len made the decision that he did. And being in his shoes, I might have made the same thing, but I wasn't in his shoes. I was trying so hard to get these details. And of course, when I did, I was really happy and thought they were really important. But they did eventually come out. So
yeah, no, it's so interesting. And it's also, it's something that I think a lot of readers don't think about is, I think a lot of journalism narratives paint journalists as, going against the fray no matter what. And I think that a lot of times those narratives leave out, that we're responsibly trying to figure out what's reportable, what's safe.
Yes, and the reason we do that is because the Pentagon Papers case, which basically decided, where the Supreme Court decided that prior censorship was not going to happen in this country, possibly under dire circumstances where the government could prove an imminent danger, but really that does not happen here. So if we are not constrained in publishing things that are classified, it puts the responsibility on the journalists and the institution of journalism to be responsible. Because even though we're we are holding the government to account, we don't want to damage the government. Well, we don't want to damage ultimately our national security by being reckless. We want to go up to the line to where we are trying to prove to the public that our stories are valid by giving them enough detail, but not so much detail that, one, it's gratuitous, and two, it really does put people at harm. And I think that's the balance that Len struck in his decision.
Yeah, I remember reading when Osama bin Laden was killed that I believe it was the White House that sent the reporters the email, "Get to work," and it was like 8 p.m. on it, and it was, I just that sort of illuminated the relationship between the two entities.
Yeah, but we don't, just to be clear, we don't negotiate. Sometimes people use that word. What we do is we tell the government what we have that's classified. I don't read them the stories. I just tell them the facts in the story, so that if I don't know the whole world that I'm reporting on, I get a glimpse of, part of it. So I don't know the ramifications of everything. And I want them to tell me, I want them to say, look, this could potentially be really damaging, or we know this detail will be damaging. Sometimes they are helpful, but often they are not. And that's when we still have the responsibility, and we still have to make good decisions. And we've been in that situation too, with the series I did called Top Secret America, where I made visual all of the agencies that worked at the top secret level on counterterrorism after 9/11, to show the waste, really, and the redundancy and the hugeness of this world. And the agencies said, don't run this, we don't want you to run this, but they wouldn't help us at all in figuring out how to make it less detailed, because we had really a lot of details. And so the editor at the time, Marcus Brauckley, he came up with a great solution, but we had to just think it through ourselves, and with I would say the advice of people in the intel world that I knew, who also understood the value of the media, and who we could talk some of these issues through with.
Yeah, absolutely. It requires a lot of humility, I imagine.
Yeah.
So there's a question in the chat. So Downey said that your stories were based on painstaking reporting and not by leaks. Do you think that's by design? It seems like in Washington now people leaked info to the press all the time. Do you feel like leaks have just become more prevalent, or do you think officials are scared to leak info to journalists?
Yeah. Well, back then, I do think, it is painstaking work. I keep thinking I'm missing something, because all these people get leaks, or it seems like they do. People get documents. I never get a dump of documents. I've never had that happen. I had it happen once, but it wasn't in the classified national security world. So I must be standing on the wrong corner or something. No, it's me, piecing together things little by little. People are reluctant to talk because even if they feel like it's a wrong-headed program in the secret prisons case, they have to pass security clearances. They are breaking the law by talking about this, so they don't actually talk about it in a very big way. And so it's painstaking in that way. But on the subject of leaks, Washington has always run on leaks. The national security world has always run on what I would call leaks. And what I mean by that is officials who are willing to engage with you on things that are meant to be private. But I think it has the government does that because, in part, that's their only choice. If they stood up at a podium and said, we're considering an embargo on, let's just pick a country, Iran, it would speak to the world that this had become an official, almost launched program, whether it was or not. But if they agree to talk to reporters on background about that, and reporters can write about that, then it doesn't take on quite the official statement image, and it can be used as a signal to Iran, watch it, or as a trial balloon for the administration to see what the reaction is. So in fact, it's almost an official leaking process that happens because everything in national security is classified. And because everything was classified in terms of fighting terrorism after 9/11, if we wanted to do our basic job, which is what's the government doing? Is it winning, losing? Is it getting to its tactical goals and its strategic goals? We had to enter the classified world. And that was because the government classified it. So again, we had to do that, responsibly. And then I think when Donald Trump became president, and he was such an unusual president, and he shook up the bureaucracies everywhere in such a fundamental way, then you had a lot more leaking of professional government bureaucrats. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, people who run that's who keep the trains running, that were genuinely worried about the functioning of government or about our relationships with other countries, or you name it, who would step forward in the shadows and talk to reporters. That was a result of the way his administration went about dealing with the bureaucracy. So it's not, it's kind of reverted back to before that, when you just had, it kind of depends on the president and the discipline that his administration can impose on people. You see many fewer leaks now because we're kind of back to a conventional president.
Yeah, it seems like it's always been sort of calculated, to your point, that it's almost a trial balloon or something.
Right.
There's something they can gain from it as well.
Definitely.
So recently you worked with a large group of reporters through the group Forbidden Stories to report on governments that were using Pegasus spyware to monitor and track journalists. How difficult was it to report this story, and how dangerous is this for journalists? I imagine it was only made more difficult because of how close you are to the issue.
Yeah, I think it's a real danger for journalists, not necessarily those in the United States, because we didn't find that they were using it here, that anyone that we could identify was using it here, which in this country would be the FBI or other law enforcement. However, there were not only autocratic countries like Azerbaijan and Saudi Arabia and UAE that were using it against their own population, but there were democracies like India and Mexico who were using it against not only their journalists, but their political opponents, like their nonviolent political opponents. And that is so much more troubling. And it also has a real chilling effect on civil society, because people, even if people aren't being monitored, they think they're being monitored. So they might not organize, not report, because they are worried about being monitored and exposing their sources and exposing their families. And that is what happens with the ones that do get monitored, is that they lose their entire privacy because the technology itself is so intrusive. It just like sits over your shoulder as you're on your phone, and it can upload even your deleted pictures and your deleted files and your deleted text messages. And it's a zero click now, so you don't even have to do anything. In the beginning of the technology, you had to click on a link that looked like a real link, but now you don't have to do anything. The phone just has to talk to the code or recognize the code, and that's it. Then it takes over your phone. And the thing that's so worrisome is that it is unregulated, that there's no international regulation, there's no national regulation. So the US has laws internally for sure about about the government monitoring people. You need a warrant, and in order to get a warrant, you need probable cause or something lower than that. But if it's a private company and a private or a foreign government, it's not really clear if there's any law against that. And then in other countries, there are no laws, or and there are no standards like we have. So there's no laws against it. So in Mexico, for instance, which was one of the first users and the largest users, there's no brakes on the system. And that's a big that's a big problem, because Pegasus and this company NSO Group, which made Pegasus, is not the only one in the market. There are more and more companies in the market to sell this, because there are more and more governments doing unsavory things against their population who want to buy it, and who don't have. What this does is it gives countries that don't have an intelligence capability, it gives them a really sophisticated capability. And the Israeli government had to, so this is an Israeli firm, and the Israeli government must give them the okay to every new client that they have. So in essence, this is an arm. It's not an official arm, but it's an arm of the Israeli government, because they must approve what, and in fact, the Israeli government, we learned, used this as a tool of diplomacy in the Middle East when they wanted to get closer to regimes like the Saudis and UAE, and they would allow this company to sell this to them as a way of getting closer to them diplomatically.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you believe that the Saudi government used Pegasus to monitor the Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi before he was murdered?
We do not have that evidence. The closest we get to that is, and this was my reporting, that the UAE, likely on behalf of the Saudis, because they're good allies, the UAE put the spyware on the wife of Jamal Khashoggi, Hanan al-Adar, while they had her in detention at an airport in the UAE. And we found, well, we didn't, but the Citizen Lab that does this kind of forensics along with Amnesty International was able to pinpoint the exact time, and they could see the keystrokes. And so they could see that it was a human being that typed it in, because they made a couple typos and had to keep going back. So that was before the murder. And that's the one for sure piece of evidence that we had. And there's no reason that they would have been interested in her. She was a flight attendant, other than she had a relationship with Jamal, and they were in constant contact trying to figure out where they would meet. So that allowed them to know where he was all the time.
Do you see that as a thread you're going to keep pursuing, or do you think it's just a matter of,
Well, we are, in the sense that Hanan and her attorney are pursuing it. They have asked the Turkish government to hand over Jamal's devices. So far, they have been rebuffed in that, and they intend to sue the Saudi government over this case, because we know the Saudi government was involved. So we will be following it in that regard. I don't think right now we have anything more forensically to do on it, but that could change. We could find something else. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know this has sort of been the thread of our whole conversation, but in your reporting, how do you balance informing the public with damaging national security and that sort of ever looming threat? I think you said something really interesting, which is that you just don't know the ramifications of everything that you're going to. That's
well,
such
yeah, it is. I mean, I think we do it consciously and carefully. And you said humbly. I mean, I do believe that in the sense that we take these decisions seriously, even though I'm sure that we don't have the reputation of doing that because you don't get to see this happening. I kind of wish you did because people might realize what goes into a case like this. We have killed stories. In fact, I was working on several stories at the same time as the secret prisons, and we did kill one of them. Kill, that means we deleted it from our system because after we had these discussions with the government, it was very obvious to us because of the details in the story that this would reveal an important method of intelligence gathering that didn't look illegal at all. It was just sort of cool, and it was just it was very effective. And when I started learning about it, I kind of thought of it as a balance to the criticism. I could also show a way that they were really effective in doing something. But because of the details, and after this conversation, we looked at it and we said, no, we can't put this in the paper because it'll for sure have to go away. And we didn't, I don't even think we bothered telling them what it was because it was so obvious.
Yeah, no, it really is not fun that no one gets to see all the mistakes you don't make. They only see the ones you do.
Well, and it's weird to be a journalist whose mission is to inform the public to have to make decisions about not informing the public. It's just counter to our culture. But when you do this kind of reporting, that's part of the package.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a message from the chat. Is there a story you killed or passed on that someone else has since published, and do you have any regrets about that?
There's only one story that I have killed, and no, nobody has written about it, and I don't have any regrets. I mean, I still think it would be a cool story someday to report, maybe, in years to come when things that were troublesome at that time are no longer. But at the moment, no, I'm actually really glad that we didn't run it. I'll say that when we were doing the Top Secret America work, and part of what we were doing is identifying buildings, and we had this great methodology that's too long to explain now, but I have explained it in the past. But we got like addresses for so many of these locations, and it was really cool when we put them on a Google map, and you could like fly to this cluster of buildings that served the NSA, and they did top secret work. But after a while, I'm looking at the map saying, I can't put this in the paper, because everyone else, including people that don't have good motives, are gonna know where it is. And so we had to peel back, or not peel back, we had to hold back a lot of information, but we still got a lot of details in the paper in that series. So I don't think it hurt the series not to have it in there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that is all we have. Is there any other questions that anyone wanted to ask Donna? All right, well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. This is such a lovely conversation, and it's just I will say just such a field I'm so unfamiliar with. So it's been so incredible to hear about it. It's such a I feel like you're walking on eggshells a lot more than many journalists are. So it's been so wonderful.
I've been very lucky, and I'm very grateful for the sort of reporting that I've been able to do.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I will let you go, but thank you so much again, and have a great rest of your week.
Okay. Thank you, Dana.
Take care.
Bye.